So we started last week to talk about the question of, is Hashem asleep? It's a question that we derive out of the Megillah, because the Megillah tells us that the beginning of the whole miracle, according to the Maharil, who is one of the masters of Jewish custom, certainly Ashkenazi custom. So he says, when you read the Megillah and you get to the 6th chapter and you say, Balayla hahu, on that night, Nadadosh Nas HaMelech, the king's sleep was disturbed, that's when the person reading the Megillah is supposed to raise their voice. The reason being, because that's where the miracle really begins. And we wanted to know, what do you mean that's where the miracle really begins? Surely the miracle began when Esther went to see the king and he extended his scepter and he didn't chop off her head. Maybe that's where the miracle began. Why? What's so unique at this point? Maybe the miracle began when Esther became queen in the first place. What's the story of the king's sleep being disturbed? And somehow that's the start of the whole Purim miracle. So what we began to learn about last week is that when the Megillah speaks about HaMelech, the king, it's not just talking about Achashverosh. It's talking about the king, the ultimate king, the king of all kings, Hashem himself. And that's the miracle over here. Because even though we say, Hinei lo yanum v'lo yishan, that Hashem never slumbers or sleeps, and it would be impossible to imagine, as we say in the prayers on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, we say, Sheina ein lefanov. There's no such thing as sleeping in Hashem's reality. Yet we're told that when the Jewish people distance ourselves from Hashem, God forbid, by our choices, when we float away and don't exactly do what we should, then God takes an attitude towards us that feels the same as when a person is asleep. Now, that effectively works as follows. There are two states that the world could exist in. A state called golus, which we badly translate as exile, and a state called geula, which is a state of redemption or liberation. But really what that means is there's a state of divine revelation, geula, wonderful, amazing, which would be akin to the daytime. And then there's a state of golus, terrible. God seems to be in the shadows, and that is akin to nighttime. That's what's interesting about this particular story. Balayla hahu, it's still the night. It's still a period of the golus. It's still a time where Hashem is, so to speak, distant from us, where we're living in the dark, and nevertheless, in spite of that, Hashem's sleep is disturbed. That's interesting. It doesn't correlate. Usually it should be either Hashem is awake or asleep. In other words, either he is present and revealed, or he is distant and concealed. The fact that in a time of concealment, Hashem should awaken, that's really interesting to us, and that's where the miracle begins. Now, we said last week that if we really want to appreciate what this is all about, we have to analyze how sleep works in the human experience, because Hashem has designed us in such a way, fortunately for us, that we could look at ourselves, analyze the nature of the human experience, and from that we can get insight into how Hashem works. We look at the human experience, we sleep. What's different about a person when they're awake or when they're asleep? The pieces are all there, right? None of the pieces disappear when somebody's sleeping. And the core functions work even when you're sleeping. The brain works, the heart works, the lungs work, the digestive system works, etc. So what's really different about when a person is awake or when a person is asleep? And as we begin to analyze this further, so it's going to become, as the expression goes, curiouser and curiouser. You see, the way that we sleep is perhaps not the ideal way. And I don't mean that we don't sleep enough, although that's definitely a problem. Ever since the advent of screens, humans have been robbed of sleep. But we're not just talking about that. When I say that we don't sleep in the ideal fashion, we don't sleep like the greats sleep. When they sleep, great tzaddik and people of an elevated spiritual nature, when they sleep, the experiences that they have are the kind of experiences we could only, excuse the pun, dream of. So let's have a look and let's understand how sleep is meant to work. Let's understand the deeper appreciation of what sleep is. And based on that, we can get a view and an understanding of what's going on over here, where the king, Hashem's sleep, is, so to speak, disturbed. So if you have a look, we are, I'm going to go to that line over there. Do you see that? It's pretty much the top line over here on the page. Okay, so one of the things that we just said is that when you're sleeping, the functions of the body still work, including awareness. Of course, it's a very different awareness to how it is any other time, but we still have awareness. And we still are able to see in the mind's eye, and we're still able to process in our minds, even though the processing system during sleep is a little bit more chaotic than while you're awake. When you're awake, your brain insists that things have to make sense. When you're sleeping, the most ridiculous things can happen in the course of sleep, and that also somehow becomes acceptable. So let's see another element of sleep, a big part of sleep, called dreaming. Now, when we dream, honestly, I know some people are very into this and they interpret their dreams and they want to know what's the significance of a dream, and they get quite carried away with it. But the Gemara tells us most dreams are simply nonsense. It's just the way we are. Most dreams are the regurgitation of things that are playing on our minds. Dreams actually are a means to excrete toxins from the mind. You know, the things that worry you. That's why many times we have anxiety dreams, right? What's the classic Jewish woman's anxiety dream? That the guests that have arrived for Shabbos and you haven't prepared anything. Well, right? What's the classic? I don't know. Everybody has their anxiety dreams. And it's just a way of flushing out all the nonsense that's playing on our minds. But really, dreams carry the potential for something very profound. So let's have a look. We're on the third word of this line, the top line that you can see on the page over here. Something that helps us to understand the nature of sleep can be identified clearly by what we see in the experience of dreaming. What happens when you dream? When a person dreams, we don't necessarily stop long enough to analyze this, but when a person dreams, it affects different elements of our soul. Our soul is comprised of what we call koichos hanefesh, which means different elements, different strengths, different characteristics, different traits that belong to our soul. You can call them generically soul powers. And when we dream, those soul powers are activated. For example, seichel umidos v'chulei. In our minds, when we're dreaming, there is an element of seichel. There is some kind of intellectual processing. That's why sometimes you have a dream, and in the dream, you ask yourself, does this make sense? Or in a dream, you may make a decision, and it's actually a rational decision. So as much as there's chaos in dreams, and many of the elements of dreams really make no sense, and they could be self-contradictory, and that's why when a person wakes up, you often say, I had the strangest dream. But nevertheless, the fact is your mind is still working and analyzing and assessing what's going on in your dream, in spite of the fact that a lot of it might be completely nonsensical. And midos, the feelings associated with situations, that definitely happens in dreams. And that's why a person could have a dream and they wake up feeling so good. Because in the dream, I saw somebody, perhaps a person who's no longer living, and they were there, and I felt the kinship, and I felt the friendship, and I felt the love for that individual, and so I feel so enriched having had that dream. Or it's possible for a person to feel sadness in a dream. And some people even wake up crying from a dream. Because midos, which are the entire spectrum of personal reactions, are still at work even when you sleep, specifically when you're dreaming. And then he goes further than that. V'gam rotzon v'tainug. Now, if you had to create a hierarchy of the human spirit, we would acknowledge this. Actions are the most superficial part of the human being, and desire is the deepest part of the human being, rotzon. Not the desire for, like, I would love to have a coffee right now. It would help me get through a Monday. The desire, rotzon, something that you care about, something that you deeply, deeply want, something that you could spend your entire life trying to achieve. That's what we call rotzon. And likewise, tainug is not just the pleasure of a transient experience. Okay, yeah, right now I'm drinking the coffee and I feel really good. Tainug means something that when it happens, fills me. It makes me feel so good on the inside, like nachas. Right? Nachas doesn't really have a good translation. I've yet to find somebody who can come up with a good translation for the word nachas. But what is nachas? It's something that fills the whole of you from the inside. Now, it's possible to experience both rotzon and tainug even in dreams. In other words, you could dream about something that you dream about, meaning to say something that you've been working towards, something that you really, really want. It could manifest in a dream. And likewise, the nachas, the depth, the richness of feeling, of pleasure, could also happen in a dream. So that's really interesting, because that tells us that the dream experience potentially could be quite advanced, it could be quite mature, it could be quite meaningful. So do we actually sleep properly? What's the test? Are my dreams meaningful? There are people out there who are of a spiritual caliber that every time they sleep, every dream that they have is deeply meaningful and deeply profound, because sleep allows them to slip into another reality that is not the reality of this world. And perhaps things open up for them, as we're about to see. Let's first talk for a moment about people like us. What if we're not at that level, where you have these deep, powerful, meaningful, insightful, maybe even prophetic dreams? We just have nonsense dreams. Still, שגם בהחלום שלו ישנם מידס, שכל, רצון ותענוג בנוגע לעניונים שישנם במציאות. What we can definitely identify from our own experience is that when we dream, we are capable of having appreciation, intellectual processing, feelings, aspirations, pleasure from things that we know are real and that exist. Mashenkin, he says parenthetically, Mashenkin in Yonim denimno is k'may pila da'ayil b'kupa d'machta, yef shaliya is gam b'chaloim. So the Gemara talks about this. The Gemara goes through a whole discussion about dreams. It's quite an interesting conversation. And the Gemara talks about whether you should take dreams seriously and what time of the night you have different dreams. And then it goes into symbolism. This kind of a dream could mean this, and that kind of a dream could mean that. And it's all against the backdrop where the Gemara says that Hashem will only give meaningful dreams, of course, to those people who deserve them. And then the Gemara says there's something that you cannot dream. You cannot dream the impossible. Now, you'll say, 1 second, I have dreamt the impossible many times. I've dreamt where 1 minute I'm driving down the street here in Johannesburg, and the next thing I'm standing at the Kotel in Israel, and then having lunch at a cafe in New York. Surely that's impossible. Yes, of course. But at the time that you're in Israel in the dream, you're only in Israel. You couldn't dream that you're in Israel and South Africa at the same time, even though sometimes we have these weird dreams where we feel like it was this location in a different country. That kind of dream we do have. But to imagine that you're in two different places simultaneously, that we're not capable of. And so the Gemara illustrates that by saying, now we're going to play a little mind game over here as we do it, because as soon as I say this, guaranteed 100%, I know exactly what image is going to be in your mind. In fact, I could probably make money off this and do a mentalist show and say, I know exactly what it is that you're going to think. So the Gemara says what you cannot even see in a dream is an elephant going through the eye of a needle. An elephant going through the eye of a needle. So here's the picture that I'm absolutely convinced everybody has in their mind right now, and that is a needle and an elephant, probably a cartoon elephant, more likely. And the elephant is big on the one side and big on the other side and extremely thin in the middle, because that's the part of it that's going through the eye of the needle. It's probably how most people picture it. That's not what the Gemara means. The Gemara means that even in the dream state, even though you suspend logic and you can have the most crazy dreams around, you cannot dream of an elephant that is the size of an elephant going through the eye of the needle while the eye of the needle is still the size of the eye of the needle. In other words, even in the dream state, we have enough logic to say certain things just cannot be. Crazy things happen in dreams, but self-contradictory things that can never present in the real world cannot present in a dream. Either the elephant gets smaller or the eye of the needle gets bigger, but it is impossible for us to imagine that there's the eye of the needle as its size and the elephant at its size, and yet the elephant's going through the eye of the needle. Okay, so why are we talking about this? I mean, it's an interesting topic, I suppose. How wild could your dreams get? The reason we're trying to discuss this is to show and to illustrate. This is the point that's relevant for us, that when a person sleeps, they do not switch off their abilities. Perhaps you downgrade from real, deep, rational thinking to weird dreaming. That's true. But you don't switch off your persona. You don't no longer have a brain or feelings or aspirations. They're all there. They're just kind of offline and not visible to the public. And that was really the point that we wanted to make, is that ultimately the difference between somebody who's awake and somebody who's sleeping is mostly for the others. Other people look at you when you're awake, your eyes are open, you can engage them, you can have a conversation, and when they're sleeping, you cannot. But as far as the person themselves is concerned, they're alive and well and kicking and fully functional. That's our first clue to understand what's going on when we say that Hashem is sleeping. We're not saying, God forbid, that Hashem is switched off. We're saying Hashem is just simply not interacting with us in the way that we'd like him to. Just like you'd want somebody to have a conversation with you, but you can't because they're sleeping. Doesn't mean there's something wrong with him. Just means you can't interact with him. So now we're going to try and unpack this a little bit further. The first part we're going to look at is relatively straightforward to understand. The second part that we're going to look into is going to open for us a whole deep concept in our understanding of spirituality. So where are we now? Just to place you, I don't know if you see there's a number 22 on the page. We're just after that 22. It's about halfway down the page. So what's the big difference between when a person is awake and when a person is sleeping? Again, bear in mind constantly that whenever we talk about this, it's only to come back to the metaphor of Hashem sleeping. So what's the difference between when somebody's awake and sleeping? Because while a person is awake, everything about them happens in a normal, orderly, rational fashion. You think about something. Once you've thought about it, you make a decision whether or not you're going to act on it. Then you act on it. There's a seder, there's an order in which things happen. And to be honest, if I know the person, I can actually predict exactly how they're going to behave and respond in a particular case because it's masudar, it's orderly, and it's kind of expected. Umikol shekain, שאין שייך שיהיו שני עניונים הופכים בבת אחת ובחיבור אחד ואפילו לא בהמשך אחד. And one of the key things about being awake is you cannot tolerate opposites simultaneously while you're awake. So in our lives, we live in sequences. For example, it is possible for a person in the same day to be both angry and joyous in the same day. Of course it's possible. But is it possible for a person in the same moment to be angry and joyous? No. Ironically, it is possible for a person to be both joyous and sad in the same moment. That's possible because those are not fundamentally contradictory. So let's say, for argument's sake, you are sending a family member overseas to study. So you're happy because it's a great moment for them and because it's right for them and it's going to be good for them. And you're terribly sad at the same time because you're not going to see them and you're not going to have them living in proximity as you normally would. So the sadness and happiness that you experience there are for the same reason. It's because you love this person. That's why you're happy for them and sad for yourself. It's not a fundamental contradiction. But it's not possible to love a person and hate the person at the same time. You could love a person and hate their behavior, that's for sure. So the nature of the awake state is things follow systems, they follow an order, they make sense, and we relate to them in a sensible, rational, orderly fashion. וכאשר כל העניינים והכוחות הם באופן מסודר, ניכר אז החילוק שביניהם ומיילס הכוחות זה על זה. Now, the fact that things happen in an orderly fashion when we are awake, that is key for us to understand why we call golus a time of sleep. Let's first understand what awake is, then we can understand what sleeping is. So the key thing about being awake is that everything in the body, everything in the human, everything in the soul operates in a healthy fashion, an orderly fashion, a hierarchical fashion. Which basically means I can identify what are the stronger elements, which are the weaker elements. I can identify what is more sophisticated, what is less so. I can identify what part of the system is critical, what part of the system is less critical. So when, for example, a person is awake, generally speaking, while a person is awake, the design that Hashem has made for us, the posture with which we sit, is a clear physical reminder of the hierarchy of the body. The brain is at the top because it's the nerve center, it's the control center of the rest of us. The brain is at the top because it's the most sophisticated part of the body. The brain is at the top because it's the part of the body that controls everything else. It's the part of the body that cannot be replaced. We still don't have a brain transplant. It's the part of the body that distinguishes us from every other thing that lives and breathes on this planet. Because our minds are so sophisticated and brilliant, that's why they sit at the top. And then in that precinct of because the body is effectively divided into three elements, the head, torso, and legs. So in that precinct, in the head, we also have other sophisticated parts of ourselves, like sight. I think we completely underestimate the incredible ability of the human eye to be able to see different color ranges, nuance, detail. The ability to smell. You know how sophisticated that is? Yes, of course, it's not unique only to human beings. But within the body, it's one of the most sophisticated functions of the body, so it's in the higher part of the body. As I go further down, so I start to deal with things which might be absolutely vital to my survival, like I have to have heart, lungs, kidneys, liver, in order to survive. That's true. But the complexity of those parts of the body is far less. Compare the brain and the heart. The heart's got one job: pump. That's what it's got to do. It's a muscle. Pump blood. It's not sophisticated. The brain is highly sophisticated. It's got to ensure that the right kind of blood is flowing through the heart. It's got to ensure that the rhythm of the heart is as it should be. It's got to ensure that the nerve centers of the body are sending messages back and forth to keep us out of trouble. There's so many things going on. And then, of course, you get to the lowest part of the body, which is the feet, which are the least sophisticated part of the body, doesn't have the same delicacy, the dexterity of the hand, doesn't have the complexity of the organs that keep a person alive. But it's important because it gets us from place to place. So when we're awake, it's pretty clear. Mind at the top, and everything else flows from that. So we understand how important a brain is, and we understand that a brain is far more important, for example, than a toe. Not that we have anything against toes, it's just a reality. And that's the importance of being awake. What happens when you sleep? You lie flat, horizontal. Now it's not so apparent that the head is so much greater or higher than the rest of the body, because effectively the head is on the same axis as the rest of the body. Sleep is like this equalizer. It's a fascinating thing that we have to lie down in order to sleep. I'm not saying you can't sleep in other environments. Just go to shul and listen to the rabbi's speech, and you could sleep in any environment. But to sleep, why did Hashem design us that we have to lie flat in order to sleep? It's not accidental. It's deliberate. He's telling us something about the nature of sleep. The whole hierarchy of the body is confused to a certain extent when you sleep, meaning you don't clearly identify what is special about the great parts of the body. So let's read that inside. Whereas when a person is sleeping, and you see this most acutely when a person dreams, when a person is asleep, in the same way as the body is horizontal, which effectively shows that no one part of the body is showing some element of greatness over the other part of the body, the experience of dreams is that it allows us to have a mashup of different soul experiences. Koyach hayoser elyonim, koyach hayoser tachtoim. That whereas in the waking state, I would know very clearly how to distinguish between an intellectual process and, say, for example, walking down the steps, which is a foot process, in dreams, these things get mashed up a little bit. And sometimes you could have different components of the human being that are operating in confusion and in collaboration. And it's possible for a person in the course of a dream to have total confusion. And those are the weird dreams that we have. Total confusion. This makes no sense. I cannot believe that, like, for example, a person will have those dreams where you feel that you can't move, or you feel that you can't speak, or you feel like you're falling. In other words, there's confusion, there's lack of control. Under normal circumstances, I'd be able to work these things out. I'd be able to work an alternative if I couldn't speak, God forbid. Or if I was falling, I'd be able to find a way to kind of stop myself. In the dream state, things are just running as if on autopilot. And different elements of the person cascade into each other. And there's no real clarity and there's no real order. And one thing is absolutely certain: when a person is asleep and when a person is in the midst of a dream, they have no way of illustrating why one part of the human experience, which should be more developed, is actually more valuable than another part of the human being that is less developed. Or in plain English, in the dream state, you might sometimes have a dream where you say, this does not make sense. In your dream, you tell yourself, this does not make sense. and yet it still continues in the dream. You're not able to shut it off by rationalizing, because in the dream state, we're not able to invoke rank. This is the brain, the rational mind, telling you how things are meant to be. And you'd better listen and you'd better accept it, because otherwise you're going to land yourself up in a lot of trouble. We're not able to do that in the dream state. So that's the point that we want to illustrate. Being awake means that the functionality of the system works with a healthy hierarchy where there's respect for the parts that are valuable, and therefore they'll be protected. And during the course of sleep, and especially when we dream, there's a lack of that hierarchy, and so there may not be the protection of the more valuable parts of the body. So we allow ourselves to become susceptible to all kinds of rubbish that comes into our minds, nightmares and the like. And that's part of the problem, so to speak, of sleep. Now, remember, all of this is purely metaphoric. The only reason we're having this conversation is because we said that during the time of the golus, during the time of so-called spiritual exile, Hashem assumes a state which is like sleep. So we now have to ask ourselves the question, if we define that sleep is a state where the normal order doesn't work and things are not necessarily respected for their value, that tells you what sleep means in spiritual terms. It means that the things that are supposed to be held in the highest esteem are suddenly not valued as much as they should. So we'll use this as a parable to help us understand how things operate in the spiritual realms. This is our first major clue. What does it mean if Hashem sleeps? What does it mean if Hashem has assumed a position which is similar to the human experience of sleep? It means that at this point in time, valuable, important things are not given the respect or the priority that they deserve. Now we get it. Now we get why we're comparing sleep and golus. Why? You want to know what golus is? Golus is not about the Jews having been shafted from their homes and living on the run. Yes, that might be something that happened during the course of golus. And yes, there are periods of our golus where we did not live in our own land. But if that is all that golus is, well, then it's fine. Put all the Jews back into the land of Israel and we've solved the problem. That's not what golus is. Golus is all about the fact that Hashem created the world, as he tells us in the first word of the Torah, as interpreted by the Midrash, Bishvil Yisrael or Bishvil HaTorah. The only reason Hashem created the world, the entire purpose, is for Jewish people and the Torah. And then we'll share and illuminate the whole world and bring the whole world into that experience. But we're the purpose. Torah is the purpose. Now, what's the reality of our world? Let's be honest. How much of the world is running around saying, the Jews are the gift that Hashem gave to the world? How much of the world is running around and saying, we need to assist the Jewish people to establish their kingdom in Israel so that they can have a temple which would be a conduit of godliness and bracha for the whole world? Who's saying that? Who's saying that the Jews are the ones we should be learning from and we should be listening to because they are the light unto the nations? Who is saying that the Torah should be the guide of morality in today's world? Not at all. All you ever hear in today's world is the Jews do this and the Jews do that and the Jews control the media and they control the banks and the Jews are whatever. And all you ever hear is that the Torah is an outdated book and who believes in this stuff, and we need to be progressive and we need to embrace all kinds of immoral behavior because that's considered modernity. The world is upside down. What should be a hierarchy, what should be a vertical system where the brain is at the top guiding the rest of the system, has become a horizontal system where everybody believes that they have equal opportunity to voice their views. That is golus. Golus is where nobody recognizes truth. Nobody recognizes value. Nobody recognizes how much we have to offer, not to change the world, not to beat the world, but to elevate, transform, and embrace the world. That's why we're here. And people don't see that. Or to be more specific, the Yisrael heim bonim lamokim. The truth is that we are called Hashem's children, as the pasuk says, "Bonim atem laHashem Elokeichem." You are Hashem's children. I know that people like to say that we're all God's children, but God in His Torah says that we, the Jewish nation, are His children. And if we're not, meaning to say if we don't behave the way that we should, which has happened, unfortunately, through the course of our history, and maybe we get demoted temporarily from that beautiful relationship of a loving father-child where we feel close and where we feel that Hashem's looking after us, at the very least, we are Hashem's slaves. And people don't like the word slave because it has such an overbearing connotation in the modern world. Slave effectively means somebody who has no rights, and slave means somebody who's been abused by somebody else. But in the Torah's definition of slave, it has a whole different perspective. Kamaimer, like we say in the Rosh Hashanah davening, im kevonim, im ka'avodim. We might be at certain times like your children, and at other times like your slaves. But you know what's interesting? Shegam eved melech hu melech lo rakem melech b'chof adin ela melech. Even if we are defined as Hashem's slaves, the unique angle that Judaism has about a slave is that the slave becomes part of the status of the master. So if you're a slave to the king, you are royalty. That's how Judaism looks at us. That's how the Torah defines us. Beloved to Hashem like a child, and part of His royal family, even if it's just as His servant. And how does the world look at us? None of the sort. The only practitioners of apartheid in the world, in Israel, right? The people who, whatever it is, there's so much negative press against the Jewish people. Nobody sees the truth. We are Hashem's children. We are what the world needs. We are the ones who are going to help people to become better, to become more harmonious, to become more spiritual. And the truth is that a child is meant to be supported by the parents. There's a whole lot of laws about what happens to a father who doesn't feed his children, and the rights of the Beis Din to step in and to do dramatic things to make sure he supports them. And likewise, a servant, a slave, has to be supported by his master. So that's who we are. Hashem's supposed to look after us. That's the hierarchy. That's how the world is supposed to operate. So what's golus? It's not working. The system's not as it should be. So what is golus? Our sages use the expression, they say, we are like children who have been sent away from the Father's table. There's a breakdown in the relationship. The hierarchy that should exist doesn't exist. And the world is chaotic and upside down, and the people who should be held in the highest respect are actually the people who are disregarded. That is called golus. That is called sleep. So at this point in time, effectively what we've done is we've helped to understand why it is that we would call the golus, which is a difficult period, the most difficult period of our history, why we would call it sleep, because what we want to illustrate is during the sleep environment, the sleep experience, things don't operate in a healthy way as they should when we're awake. In golus, things don't operate in a healthy way as they should when we're awake. The hierarchy is broken. The respect and centrality that we're supposed to have in Hashem's eyes seems to have been suspended. That's called golus. Now, at this point in time, I think everybody will acknowledge it's bad. It's bad news. Nobody wants to be in a situation where the individual who is meant to care for you has, so to speak, detached from you. Nobody wants to be in a situation where your worth and your value is disregarded. Nobody wants to be in a situation that is chaotic. Nobody wants to be in a situation that is painful. So the moment you tell me that sleep equals golus, we get it. You don't actually have to explain it. We've been around for all these thousands of years. We know how painful it is. We know what it feels like. We know what it is to be persecuted. We know what it is to have our books burnt and be driven out of everybody's lands. We get it. We know it's a bad dream and we wish we could wake up. That's the easy part of what it is that we're going to learn in this mimer. Because it's easy to identify pain. It's easy to identify what is wrong with the system. It's easy to identify when we're going through rough times. The trick is, how do you find the positive in all of that? How do you find something that we could take from this experience that will help us to appreciate that, yes, of course, sleep has all these downsides, but let's be honest, Hashem has designed the world that you cannot survive without sleep. Hashem has designed the world that a third or so of our day is sleep. Hashem has designed the world in such a way that you need to refresh yourself in this particular way. I mean, I don't know about you, but often I think at night, this is so bizarre. Why do we have to do this? Why do we have to switch off for all of these hours and lie here prone in a horizontal position? Like, why? So there's got to be something about sleep that we haven't yet explained, and we haven't yet defined. A spiritual dimension of what sleep is that will totally change our perception, not so much of sleep, but certainly of golus. If you remember, this maimer that the Rebbe is teaching is based on a maimer, a discourse from his father-in-law, the previous Rebbe. And so here he quotes what the previous Rebbe says in his discourse. Okay, now we're going to enter into a more complicated concept just to help us understand what's going on over here. So what happens when a person is sleeping? We've identified that what happens when you sleep is that the functionality of the body remains, even the functionality of the soul remains, but what doesn't happen is the healthy hierarchy. So when you look at the sleeping person, or if you actually had to analyze the sleeping person's own experience, while the person is sleeping, they themselves do not see the value of the higher elements of their personality. They don't see the value of their own mind. They don't see the value of their heart, etc. So we've got to now use a different concept where we see a similar principle, and we're going to make a comparison between them. So in order to understand this concept, let's go back a step. Let's say, for argument's sake, that it was deep in the winter and you needed to warm your house. And let's just say, for argument's sake, that you're one of those people who likes, as has become quite popular recently, you like to have a fireplace in your house, like the good old-fashioned fireplace in your house. So you go and you get firewood, and you put the firewood into the fireplace, and you get some kind of a stimulant to start the fire, whatever it is that you use, and you ignite the fire and it bursts into flame. At that point in time, you look at the fire, and what do you see? Fire. And when you look at the fire, you don't only see the fire, you feel the fire. It's alive. It's warm. And at that point in time, nobody can deny the fact that there's fire in the room, that there's fire in the fireplace, because they can feel the warmth and they can see the flames. So the mystics use that as a metaphor to explain when the neshama is activated, meaning to say when the koichos, when the abilities, when the power of the soul is working, you can see it. So when a person's using their brain and somebody talks to you and shares a really profound idea, you don't have to theorize, does this person have a brain? You can see it. You can feel it. Wow! Amazing. This person is so clever. Look how well they are giving across this particular concept. Amazing. You feel the warmth. You feel the power. Likewise, other koichos hanefesh, other abilities of the soul. Let's say love. So when a person expresses love, a parent takes their child, grabs them and hugs them and kisses them and says, I love you. You don't have to debate it. You don't have to read a book to work out, is this non-verbal expression of love? You can see it. It's alive, it's warm, it's dynamic. We call that koichos hagluyim, where the abilities of the soul are clear. They are revealed. You can identify them, you can experience them. Now what happens when a person is not currently teaching, or not currently showing love to their child. Let's say that the child is at school and the parent is at home. Does the parent still love the child? So let's go back to your fireplace. A few hours later, maybe even the next morning, you come back to the fireplace, and instead of seeing the roaring fire, you see coals. And the coals are white. And you don't actually feel that they're necessarily still hot. I once made that mistake many years ago when I was a kid, and it was a Lag BaOmer bonfire that a few of us had done together, a few of my friends, and at the end we had to put out the fire, so we were taking sand and dumping it on the fire. And I picked up a brick, not knowing that the brick had been inside the fire. I picked it up to throw, to kind of smother the fire, and I burnt all my fingers. You look at those coals, you don't realize that they're hot, but don't touch them. Don't touch the coals, they're hot. And in fact, if you just fan them a little bit, you'll see they start to glow. That's what we call koichos hanelomim. That's basically where a person, of course you have love. It's just that the love is not activated at this point in time. It's no less love. Just because the child is at school doesn't mean that the parent doesn't love the child. The love is there. The love is strong. The love is deep. It just doesn't right now have a voice because the context isn't right for it. But fan it, bring the child through the door at the end of the school day, and there the love explodes back onto the scene again, and you can see the love. And then you get something that is fascinating. Something that perhaps kids in today's world don't get to see enough. When we were growing up, before technology invaded all of our spaces, it was quite common for people to go out and to hike and to camp. I'm not saying nobody does it anymore, but I think people do it a lot less. And of course, one of the fun things to do was to find flintstones and knock them together to create a spark. Not that we ever started a fire from the spark, but you look at that stone, that flintstone, you say, where is the fire? Where is that spark? Okay, so we understand the spark is actually produced from friction, but what's interesting is if that stone had to lie for hundreds of years in a river, and you would take it out and immediately hit it against another flintstone, it would immediately make a spark. That means to say that there's a level at which the koyach, the actual capacity, the potential for a specific expression of soul, can be so dormant that you don't even know it's there. But that doesn't mean that now it's going to take a whole lot of exercises and a whole lot of effort and a whole lot of intervention in order for it to be able to express itself. It can express itself like this. Here we're calling that koiches haklulim be'etzem hanefesh. The essence of my soul is not a composite. You don't take brains or intellect and love and fear and compassion and roll them all together and get a soul. It's not how it works. At the essence of the soul, it contains within it the potential to release every one of those different koiches hanefesh. Every one of them is there in this dormant fashion, and if you strike it against the right catalyst, it will come into existence. But when you look at the essence of a person's soul, you won't be able to see anything. You won't see intellect, and you won't see love, and you won't see compassion. You won't see any of that. You'll only see soul. Now, of course, it goes without saying that that talks about a very lofty, very deep level of the person, where I'm so deep into my soul that I don't yet even have the parameters of my personality and my character. It's very deep within me. But here's the first irony. The irony is that if when a person is asleep, we don't see the functionality that is normal, that reminds us a little bit of if you had to look not at the sleeping person, but if you had to look at the person's soul, you also wouldn't see their functionality. And you also wouldn't see the greatness of the mind over the feelings and so forth. So there's got to be some link over here. There's got to be some kind of an insight that the sleep world gives us into the deep soul world. And there's got to be something about the deep soul world that is also there in the sleep world. And that's what we're going to examine, please God, next week. And this is where our view of sleep will start to revolutionize. And with it, our view of golus will start to revolutionize. To be continued, please God.